Welcome. We're going to talk about a number of things tonight. Last time we covered just the basics of planning, what's zoning, what's planning, what's land use. Tonight we're going to do a little deeper dive into this and understand what actually happens. So, what is planning? Planning is finding out where you are today, where you want to go, and how you're going to get there. All of those elements have to be met in order for planning to proceed within a community. These are your planning commissioners. The planning commissioners that are in the room, please raise your hand. Mr. Stoller, Mr. Gross, Mr. Patno, Mr. Cullen, and Mr. Allgood. So several of them have joined us. Mr. Patno, the gentleman right here, is our chairman and presides over our meetings. Planning commissions were created by the state of Tennessee in state statutes. The majority of a sitting planning commission cannot be public employees. That's to prohibit the political process from invading the planning process. We are a regional planning commission. We have 9 members, and we have to have 2 members from outside the city limits. There are 2 members on our planning commission that do not reside in Kingston Springs. That way we can cross-pollinate information from the county to the cities and provide feedback in other arenas. We have a chair. We have a vice chair who's Mr. Campbell. I think most of you may know Tony Campbell. And we have a secretary. Okay, this one's going to be a little bit difficult to see. It's a little light in here today. But what I wanted you to see today is a typical agenda packet for our planning commission. Just what does it look like? What does that package look like that goes to them? What are they reviewing? This is the meeting that just occurred Thursday. So we have an agenda. These are the projects that were considered other than approving the minutes, approving the agenda, and doing roll call. This is what was considered. The BP, which will be a Sunoco, was discussed. We amended the zoning book to clarify the permitting process and a recommendation that goes to the City Commission. We reviewed the sudden service shell. They wanted to expand the back of their building. We reviewed also the McPherson property, which is the property next to the storage units on East Kingston Springs Road where all the grading and the dirt work is going on. And I know you all probably have questions, but if you don't mind, just hold them until we're through, and that way I can answer them all. All right, so that is basically what the Planning Commission looks at in a packet. The Planning Commission meets every second Thursday of every month at 7 p.m. in Aubrey Beck Hall right next to City Hall. That's where they meet. So, all right, long-range planning. When we talk about planning, we look at project review, which is what's happening today and being submitted for review to the Planning Commission. But we also look at long range. What's the impact of that particular project? How do we absorb it? How do we provide for it? How do we take care of issues like traffic, water, sewer, schools, policing? All of those discussions are then held. We analyze the problems or issues to determine what is the barrier or what's going to cause that to not be something we could easily absorb. We formulate goals to address it. We develop and evaluate alternate courses of action. Have you ever heard the expression, there's more than one way to skin a cat? That's true in planning as well. There's more than one way to approach an issue, a development, or a project. Okay, development issues in Kingston Springs in general. This is not project specific, but just in general. We have limited land available to develop on, for sale, or available. We have environmental limiters that include flood zones, Tennessee blue line streams, and by the way, blue line streams are regulated by the state, and the state dictates that no development of any kind or disturbance can occur from the top of the blue line stream as it's defined on a map, 35 feet back on either side. This will become important to you when you see something later. Topography. There are lots of places in Kingston Springs and in the growth boundary where topography, elevation is a problem. Traffic. Corridors, connection, and the volume. So if I were to ask this group, what is the busiest corridor at 4:10 to 5 p.m. in the afternoon in Kingston Springs. Exactly. And if you're sitting downtown in front of City Hall, you've kind of got a primetime view of what that looks like when it comes through town. So those are things that we're looking at. Traffic studies are being done. One was done in 2009. We're moving forward with that. So those traffic volumes and connectors, do we have sufficient streams to carry the traffic, just like with water? So that's something we need to begin looking at. Zoning, are the lots appropriately zoned? If you have, say, a R1 district, which requires an acre, and you have a development that has half-acre lots, then I would say that's not appropriately zoned because they can't meet the lot requirement, the setback requirement, they can't meet the accessory dwelling requirement or other restrictions of that zone. So it's probably not appropriately zoned. And then several months ago, the Planning Commission considered a multitude of lots that are relatively large footprint parcels given the size of the town and did a PUD overlay. That gives them both a little more control over what's located, and it also gives them a little more flexibility in the design rather than everything being done in little boxes. Sometimes you can make it fit the land instead of making the land fit the project. Does that make sense? One of those properties that's been applied to is Mr. McPherson's property next to the storage facility on Kingston Springs Road. There's a PUD overlay on that project now. There is a PUD overlay on a number of properties going down Liban Hills Road for vacant properties only. You can't assign a PUD to a property that's already built out. Okay. Now, when I talked about limiting factors, everything that you see that's kind of shaded and shadowed, all of that, all the way around the city, is your flood zone. It is regulated, it is mapped, you participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and Kingston Springs does not allow building in a flood area, period. Okay? The next limiting factor, remember I mentioned blue line streams. So for every, this is Kingston Springs proper, the pink line that you kind of see going around is the city boundary, and all of these little blue lines are regulated by the state of Tennessee. Nothing can be disturbed within 35 feet of the top of the bank as the stream is defined on either side. So you can start to see that it eats into a lot of property. These are topo maps. The more little squiggles that you see, the higher the elevation and the more the change. So there's a lot of topographical issues here as well. You also have a railroad, you have the Harpeth River. I mean, just a number of things come together to limit development that are outside the control of the town. Your flood ordinance is a FEMA product. Your blue line streams are a state of Tennessee regulated product. We have no control over those. If EPA has a restriction, we have no control over that either. So this is downtown. The little box that you see right there with numbers on it, I hate to keep walking in front of this, but I want you to be able to orient yourself. This is City Hall in Aubrey Beck, where the meetings take place. Downtown Kingston Springs. This is the flood area. Now you see it's moved slightly off to the left. This is City Hall. This is the flood area. So those large parcels that are located adjacent to the city are limited by blue line. Now they can build where there's not a flood area, but they can't build within it, and they can't build within 70 feet of that blue line stream. So that limits development a lot. Okay, this is the area at Liban Hills out by the interstate. You guys recognize that okay? You can see, you can orient yourself where you are. All the area on the right-hand side that is shaded with these colors, all of this is flood area. Can't be built in at all. So, how many of you lived here during the flood in 2010? Okay. So, from my perspective, having worked 14 different flooded areas in my career, it's a really good idea not to put stuff in the flood area. So, it's a smart move because it usually costs more to rebuild, but they do allow you to rebuild if your property is already in a flood area and it's damaged. But you have to elevate it so that it doesn't happen over and over and over again, because when it does, you, the taxpayer, get to pay for it. So, what planning has been done in Kingston Springs so far outside the normal monthly meeting? And all of this will go on the website and will be live linked. You'll be able to click it and read the documents and look at them. The growth plan was required in every county in the state of Tennessee, and that bill passed in 1996. They were required to complete their plans by the year 2001. They were very basic, minimal growth plans. And growth areas were defined by saying, here's a major corridor, we're going to go out this far, and they drew a line on a map, and that became a growth area. Over the years, it's become apparent that if you're in the middle of the wildlife management area, where you don't have water, sewer, internet, cable, you don't have anything to support growth, that shouldn't be in a growth area, right? Growth should be where you can provide services, because under the charter of the city, they're required to provide the same services to every resident. You can't pick and choose to say, well, I'm going to give Mr. Patton water, but Mr. Stoller can't have any. You have to be able to equally provide those services. So that's how growth areas should be established. AIA, which is the American Institute of Architects, came to town in 2008. There were a series of meetings at the high school, lasted 2 days. They drew an absolutely wonderful blueprint for the preservation of Kingston Springs and encouraging development and growth in the right way downtown and other areas. And then the land use plan was done almost simultaneously with that. And all three of those documents are doorstops. And I mean that in the literal sense. They prop open doors. They're not useful, they're not used. The only time they ever come up is it located in a growth area before a permit is issued in the county? Because everything within the cities is considered a growth area. And a large area around the city is considered a growth area. So they really, although they were really well done, had lots of community input, they never went any further. They just stopped there. And then there's been a lot of discussion lately about traffic and the impact that two projects in particular will have on traffic, the Sunoco and the Thorntons, on that corridor. What will that do to our traffic grid? So you should know that the last traffic study, it's a state road, that's the first thing you should know, because we don't have any control over state road. We don't get to tell them who can connect to it and who can't. It belongs to TDOT, state road. TDOT did their last planning study in Kingston Springs for East Kingston Springs Road and Lyman Hills Road going to the interstate in 2008. At that point, the access ramp going on to I-40 West was rated an F. Now, I'm pretty sure they used the same grading standards that I got in school. You know, if I got an F, probably not too good. The one coming off the interstate into Kingston Springs is rated a D. Okay, so just so you know that. The Thorntons traffic study, we required them to do one. And we required them to do it and submit it to TDOT before it came to us. So we had the Tennessee Department of Transportation comments before we ever started looking at it. The net increase of traffic will be 7 units an hour to Kingston Springs, to Lyman Hills Road. That's their traffic study. We not only sent it to TDOT, we sent it to the city's engineer, which is a point of contention for some of our planning commissioners. And I somewhat agree with them, because when you do a traffic study, they were only required to take in the impact from their lot. They weren't required to take in the existing traffic coming off of East Kingston Springs Road or from other areas onto us. That changes. It's kind of like when you do something in a flood area. I can do an engineering report in a flood area that says I'm not increasing the flood no matter what I put in it. And the way I do that is I widen the floodplain. Or I increase the speed of the water, which is an engineering run they do called a HEC-RAS. Doesn't change what happens on the ground, but it appears that it does, right? So you should know that when you read any engineering report. Depends on what you feed into it, is what you get out of it. Then Mr. McPherson, who is the gentleman up by the storage buildings, did another traffic study. So those three reports collectively will start a dialogue with TDOT about, hey, we really have to find a way to address this traffic. And it's like every other day, one lane or the other shuts down on I-40 because of a wreck, and then that backs things up. So TDOT, as I understand it, John, is going to have a series of meetings in this hall for I-40 corridor improvements. Best advice I can give a group of citizens, show up. Talk out loud. Tell them what it feels like, looks like, smells like, and how hard it is. That's how things get done. Floodplain management, there's a link. Again, all of these will be live. You'll be able to click it and go to it that tells you what the law is, what we do, what the process for review is. Even though we don't allow it, every lot that touches a flood area still has to be reviewed for the federal government. Who knew, right? Okay, development. I hear a lot, I want a Cracker Barrel, I want a Kroger, I want more restaurants, I want more shops. I don't like having to drive. The Dollar General is closed. I hear all of these things all the time. What drives development of that type is rooftops. So we've talked about the limiting factors in the city as far as the ground itself, the land. So in order to develop rooftops to get to that level where you get the new grocery store, the new restaurants, the new others, is a little bit of a challenge. So, and can you absorb the growth when it comes? Let's say, for example, somebody sells one of the large Century Farms that are in Kingston Springs, and you got 125 acres to play with. You can put a lot of houses on 125 acres, but can the road sustain it? Can you provide water, sewer, fire service? Will the school absorb the children? Can your police keep up with the activity? Can you provide medical care? All of those things have to be provided before you can allow it to happen. So what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Something I learned in planning school. The argument is, does commercial development come first and then the houses follow? Build it and they will come. Or do the houses come first and commercial development follows? It's a pop quiz for Mr. Stoller. Which one comes first? That is probably the most common misconception about development and economic. Everybody who wants to develop commercially looks at the number of rooftops. If you don't have clientele base to feed that, or you're not something like a museum or an attraction or an amusement park, if it's a service to the people or a service where they shop, the houses have to come first before you can get the other things. Workforce housing. Okay. This subject may or may not get me shot, but that's okay. I'm used to that too. Buckshot's kind of something I do well. Who's been down Liban Hills Road in the last week? Raise your hand. Okay. You're probably looking at the new builds, the traffic. Maybe you have business there that you need to take care of. You're on your way to the interstate. I look at different things. I look at traffic, timing, flow, and I also noticed when I was looking the other day that every single business on that corridor has a help wanted sign on it. Every single business. The Sonic, the Dollar General, every business has a help wanted sign, which leads me to workforce housing. Affordable housing can or cannot be a bad thing. Depends on how you do it. So if you throw up 600 apartment buildings or units on a small piece of land with no amenities and no thought for what it looks like and no thought for the traffic pattern, probably not going to be able to internalize that very well. But if you, I mean as a city, you're not going to be able to provide for that or absorb it. And then it's going to have an impact on the lots next door for property value. The better way to do that is to integrate them into traditional neighborhoods. I'm going to explain what I'm saying. Rather than build 600 units in a block, which rarely ever works out for anybody, right? You use a few units. Maybe they're slightly smaller houses. Maybe the lot's slightly smaller. Maybe the finishes inside the house aren't as good as the finishes would be in the others. And I don't know about you, but my first granite slab in my kitchen came about 10 years ago, right? I had laminate. So the distinction is that you put a few units and spread them out so that when your children graduate college or high school, they can still afford to live where you do because they can't afford to drive from external counties to work service jobs for slightly above minimum wage. So that's why you don't have help in these stores. That's what's driving that. Then first-time buyer housing. Not a lot on the market in Kingston Springs, right? Not a lot. So, and by the way, I wanted to cover the workforce housing. We had a discussion last time, for those of you here, about HUD houses, Section 8 houses, and I explained to everybody that HUD houses are not the building. HUD houses is a voucher or a grant that goes to the applicant. Any house in Harpeth Meadows subdivision can be a HUD house. Who knew, right? Any house downtown can be a HUD house. Any house in the manufactured mobile home park across from City Hall, as long as it meets the inspection requirements. So the HUD standard for a one-bedroom apartment in Cheatham County for the rental basis is $1,591 a month. Now, if I'm a developer and I'm building affordable housing for people and I'm charging $1,591 a month, I'm not building bad housing, right? So hopefully that helps to understand what the need is and what the connection is. You have to have housing for everybody who lives in your community. Everybody. Otherwise your town dies because you can't get help. Mixed-use design and housing. Sometimes you can blend commercial and residential together. And I use this with my planning commission all the time. How many of you know where Vantage Point in Ashland City is? Okay. Vantage Point is an apartment complex that's gated, has some amenities on the lot, and on the same lot there is a memory care assisted living property. So what happened when that was built out, and in the front there's a little commercial strip where they'll put in a hair salon, they'll put in a dentist office, things that people need who live in both populations, right? There's a playground, there's a swimming pool, there's other things. How that worked out beautifully for that particular community is a lot of the CNAs and nursing assistants and administrative people who work in the memory care assisted living live in the apartment complex on the same lot. So their commute is across the parking lot. So they're not contributing to traffic unless they're shopping. They have reliable transportation. My grandpa used to call it Penny and JoJo, one leg, the other, and they just go across the parking lot and go to work. So that's what I mean by mixed-use design and housing. Differing points of view. Okay, I'm going to call everybody out. Who wants more rooftops in Kingston Springs? Raise your hand. Who wants more development, building? Okay. Who would like to see growth? All right. Who would like to close the door and say that's enough? So there you go. Now, you groups that raised your hand, and some of you didn't because you're kind of not sure yet how you feel about it. I am neither anti nor pro-growth. You need to know that. I work for the town. I do the reviews. I don't live here. As my granddaddy said, I don't have a dog in the fight, right? I just do the book. So, as you think about that particular question, do I want growth? Do I not want growth? In order to have the amenities that you want, you have to have growth because the businesses that open have to have customers to survive. They have to have workers to wait on you when you get there. They have to have people to clean, to stock, to do all those things. So you got to have one or the other. You've either got to decide you're cool with driving to Bellevue or wherever else you drive to get what you want, or you've got to decide that you can live without it because you can't get it. Not enough rooftops, okay? Someone suggested, not a bad suggestion, that we should look at historic preservation. Downtown Kingston Springs has some beautiful old buildings. There's a lot of history in this town. It's a really deep history. You should go on the city's website and just read the history of the town. It's interesting. And I think that preservation is an outstanding idea. Where I think it runs off the track is when we get too deeply invested in telling people what color they can paint their house or what kind of flowers they need to put in the yard. So when you go down that path, how do you decide whether yellow is better than blue, red is better than green? Because that is a personal preference, right? So, I mean, I live on 11 acres in the middle of nowhere. Paint my house any color I want to, right? It's my house. I choose to live there. But downtown, we do need to preserve what we have. But if we start investing in every little detail, you become Hilton Head or Seaside or some where everything looks the same, or you Pleasant View Village where everything's red brick. So, slippery slope. What are the impact of build-out scenarios? Well, I kind of went over that briefly. If you don't grow, you live like you live right now. And you live with the stores closing, the restaurants closing, other things closing because you don't have suitable housing for people to work here. If you build out huge rooftops, you're not going to be able to absorb it. You don't have the traffic corridors, you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the schools, you don't have the stuff to absorb that growth. And you cannot escape the environmental impacts. The flood areas and the blue lines, you're stuck with those. They're outside of your control as a town. What is desired? Okay, I'm just going to quickly just ask a few people. What would you like to see in Kingston Springs? What would make your day better? You.
I would like to see downtown, be a cute, nice little downtown, but I'd like the unique character of Kingston Springs. I don't want to be a carbon copy of suburbia.
Okay, that's a really valid point. You don't want to lose your identity as a town. You don't want to look like everybody else, right? So if you could have anything that you wanted downtown, or in Kingston Springs, what would it be?
I don't have an opinion.
He doesn't have an opinion. Who would like to see more restaurants? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. Who would like to see a big box store like a Lowe's or a Home Depot? See? So I do this for a reason. While you all think you have differences, because I had some of you raise your hand, I'm anti and I'm pro, you have things you agree on. Who thinks downtown's worth saving? All right. So, unlike politer people, I'm just going to tell you the truth. If you don't put in some affordable housing that does not require people to drive great distances to work, your downtown will slowly ebb and die. Your children will move elsewhere. And I'm part of the aging population. I'm 64. I'm a year away from being done. So when you don't have options for housing for everyone, your children move somewhere else and work. And the brightest and best, and that feeling of community, of knowing people, of seeing your neighbor and knowing who they are and knowing their kids starts to go away because the town starts to die. So it's an option for you to consider. We've covered all of that. Okay, what does the Planning Commission actually do? They promote coordination and cooperation. Sometimes we have more cooperation than we do others. They review public improvements. Before a park, before a street, before a sidewalk, before a T grant, before any public improvement, a fire hall, before any of those get done, by law they have to be reviewed by your Planning Commission. Why? Because they're apolitical. They're looking at it for the good, the point of view for the good of the community. So they're required by law to review it before it can be approved or used. They prepare a general regional plan. In your case, that's your land use plan that's now 11 years old and is reactive and was required by the state and doesn't address the issues that you have today. Subdivision regulations, I want to chop that up and build that. They're responsible for those, and they write them and approve them and adopt them. Design review guidelines. I want to build that commercial building. Well, we're going to need it to look like this. So when you build a commercial building here, you can't just slap up whatever you want. You have to go and see them, and they have to approve. There's a list of accepted materials that will stand the test of time, and that's what you have to use. That's why the Thorntons looks like it does. Who knew? All right. They refer. The only mandatory referral they have is on a rezoning application. When someone wants to rezone, a lot of people assume that the Planning Commission approves that. They don't. They're a recommending body. So they know more about land use and growth and population, all those things, than the City Commission does on average. That's not true of every circumstance. But this is what they do every month. So when someone wants to rezone, they hear it first, and then they recommend approval or recommend not to approve to the City Commission. Then it goes to the City Commission where it's heard twice. There's a public hearing where the public gets to have input. So I hear a lot of conversation about we don't know what's going on. If you're not tripping over it, you're not looking, because it's everywhere. It's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, it's everywhere. It's on the city's website. So what I have asked the city to do is we're going to start publishing the packets before the meeting so you can actually see all the stuff that went in it that they're going to talk about before you get there. They prepare and recommend a zoning ordinance and map. They review amendments to the zoning ordinance. Anytime you want to change something, they review them and recommend them forward to the City Commission. There's your zoning ordinance. It's online, you can find it. That tells you what is all over this town. So that's kind of what it looks like. And all down Lyman Hills Road is Zone C2, which is highway commercial. And it's highway commercial because it's adjacent to an interstate, and there is no other location where it's appropriate to put that kind of traffic. Could you imagine picking up the Thorntons and dropping it in downtown Kingston Springs? Or maybe we should go to the Ranchettes and plop it down there. So that's why it's zoned the way it is. It's because it's the only appropriate location. And there isn't a community anywhere, including Metro Nashville or San Francisco, where the transportation corridor improvements don't fall behind the development that comes, because there has to be a need before the dollars can be spent from the federal level. So it's like an accident site. They have to have X numbers of accidents on an intersection before they can do improvements, before the feds will release the money to do it. Who knew? Otherwise, they have to take it out of your pocket as taxes. Of course, they're taking it out of your pocket anyway at the federal level. They're just not taking it as fast. So, let me go back. Sorry, I apologize. There's a link here. I'm going to have to redo this one. So, I've heard a lot of conversation about Thorntons. And I want you to understand what that looks like to them, to the Planning Commission, the people who review. This is the file for Thorntons. So every single one of these in every single folder, including that one, including this one, including this one. This one was just for the signs, just to get them through the sign process. And then all of these other documents in this entire string were required before the Thorntons was approved. They submitted for the zoning case study in February of 2017. They were finally approved 2 years later. So it's not a process that happens by happenstance. It's not a process where people come in the door and go, "Hi, I'm Bob, you know me, let me do that." And that same process is applied to every single project that comes in the door. Whether it's a driveway permit, not that extensively, but we review every single thing that comes in. And that it has to meet the guidelines or it can't go through. But if it meets the zoning designation, legally we can't tell them no. So the only cure to that is to rezone. And then it begs the question and the legal invite of where do you allow them to do it? You can't prohibit. The state law is so clear. This is kind of an interesting demonstration, but it's true. Did you know you cannot forbid a strip club in your jurisdiction. It's against the law for you to forbid it. So how do you deal with that when somebody comes to town? You're like, well, I want to have one. I want to have it right across the street from the church. You're like, well, no. Well, maybe I'll put it next to the school. Well, no. There's nothing in your zoning book that says you can or can't, so how do I push that envelope if I'm the guy that wants to build it? So what you do is you use your zoning book. You say, yep, you can have it. You can have it in the industrial zoning. It can be open from the hours of 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. You can have only so many square feet on the lot. That's how you do it. You can't say no in zoning. It's against the law. So sometimes things happen for a reason. By the way, you have strip clubs in your zoning book. They're in the industrial section. So, because you don't want them to interact with other populations. So that's how you do it. All right, they implement these things through the subdivision regs online, zoning ordinance online. Capital budget and public improvement, if I permit it, I have to be able to supply for it, right? So it goes from planning to budget to how do we implement this. Watershed decisions are important because you have huge flood areas and blue lines. There are exemptions to zoning. I'll get to those in a second. They adopt and amend. They enforce and administrate. So who in here thinks that we don't enforce anything in Kingston Springs with regard to land use? I can tell you that we do, and I can tell you the noise is significant, and I can tell you that noise occurs in public, and it occurs in planning commission meetings, and it occurs in the city manager's office and on my telephone, and they call the elected official and they call the appointed official. Trust me, we enforce. So it's a messy, loud process, enforcement. It's messy and loud. Why? Because I don't want you to do what you're doing, and I'm telling you not to do it on your property. And your property is your property, but your property, or what you do on your property, can't annoy your neighbor. So by law, we have to enforce it, and we try to be respectful. And we try to get your attention, and we try to work with you, we sit down and talk to you, and we try to figure out a way together to get it done. When that doesn't work, we try another route. So when you hear that noise, that's what it's a result of. By the time you hear public discussion, and there's public anger or angst, that discussion's already been taking place for months. So, all right, Board of Zoning Appeals. If they don't agree with me, they can appeal what I say, except for a rezone request. They cannot appeal that. But if I make a decision, they're allowed to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. But the perimeters for an appeal are state law, and it has to do with the land. It can't just be because I'm mad because I want to do it, because Bob did it last year, I want to do it now. There are legal things they have to use. All right, zoning exemptions. You do not have pure agricultural zoning in Kingston Springs. Were you aware of that? There is no pure agricultural zoning district. Agricultural zoning districts are exempt from zoning regulations under Tennessee law. You cannot apply zoning restrictions to agricultural property. Period. State law has 16 separate statutes. The case that really kind of put the cherry on top for me, there was a farm in Black County. They were flying airplanes and charging for plane rides over the corn maze. The neighbor next door didn't like it, filed a complaint. The state said they're insulated. They thought, well, that was good. So we're going to have music festivals. And when they had them, they had them. They had them like 1,500 folks at a time. Loud rock bands, big speakers. And the neighbor next door was really, really mad. That one went all the way to the appellate level. The appellate court of the state of Tennessee said, no, that's not insulated. Guess what happened the next Monday? The state legislature passed legislation saying they could have them. So they changed the law to accommodate the use. Look up the Blount County case. It's an interesting thing to read. So sometimes legislative decisions at the state or federal level outside of the town's control lead to things happening that we don't have any control over. We can't usurp their authority. They outrank us. It's kind of like me telling my husband, who was a CW05 of the Marine Corps, that he has to go outside and walk line, right? So, historic zoning is exempt in some cases, and your flood ordinance is exempt. You can't adopt new zoning statutes and override existing historic preservation documents. If they're already in place, they stay in place. Airport zoning, I think you're good for that. Haven't seen one out here lately. Solid waste facilities are exempt from zoning because you have to have them, right? Residences of challenged or handicapped persons, that's a really sensitive area of the law. There's a lot of legislation that goes with it. You cannot touch them with a zoning ordinance. So when the rehab center wants to locate, they get to locate. You can't stop it. So manufactured residential dwellings are exempt with one exception. All manufactured homes are inspected in the factory, purportedly by the state of Tennessee. They inspect 5% of those units in each factory. So from that, we can't apply building code to them when they're manufactured. But once they're installed on the lot, we can require them to be on a permanent foundation. We can require them to have utilities like a stick built. And then when they have code issues, we can enforce them. Telephone and telegraph. Teleco River, they're not here, so we don't have to care. Transfer of development rights. Who knows what that is? It's a growing trend in land use. I own 1,500 acres. I don't want a development, but I'm going to transfer my development right to a development district outside of your jurisdiction, and they get to decide what happens. And your planning commission doesn't even get to weigh in on it. So if they wanted to put 2,000 apartment units and it's being done by the development district, you can't stop it. So that was done originally to enforce affordable housing in jurisdictions. And that's how you ended up with large block buildings everywhere. And the statute is still in place. Contract zoning. If you contract the zoning out to another company as a city, and some cities have done this, they contract their zoning out to a company and say, hey, you make all the decisions for us. And then you don't like what they did? Too bad. That's why you should do it yourself. And then residential land use improvement areas. Sometimes they're known as HUD zones, enterprise zones, distressed areas. You don't get to dictate what happens in those either. So, ethics. All of my planning commissioners are ethical people. I know all of them. I've worked with them for a length of time. And even under pressure, they do what they're supposed to do. The principles of ethics are defined by the state. They include conflict of interest. If you have a financial interest, whether it is direct or indirect, in any decision that is being made, you have to recuse yourself from the discussion and from the vote. You have to declare it for the public record. And the folks that work with me on a routine basis will tell you I will cause that to happen every single time because it puts them in jeopardy. Sunshine law. That means you can't meet behind the door and have discussions leading to a vote. So Mr. Patnode and Mayor Gross, who also sits on the Planning Commission, cannot meet outside the meeting hall and say, how are you going to vote? I'm going to vote yes or I'm going to vote no. They can't do that. That violates the Open Meetings Act. And if you haven't learned anything yet in the 2 meetings, we're very open about what we do. We do it out loud in a public hall. We ask you to come. We'll give you the documents. Everything we do is flow through, clear view. All right, due process is defined by federal statutes. It's also defined by the Constitution of the United States. Land use is insulated by the Constitution. We cannot violate those. So these links, I want you all to visit them when they go up. All right, target date, population milestone. When we have 2,000 people move to Kingston Springs, we have to improve Liban Hills Road by putting pressure on TDOT, or we have to find another way for people to navigate because we have now hit a level of unserviceability to get to the interstate, and we back traffic up all the way down to the school. We have danger now. So that's what that means by your target date population in planning. You usually do capital improvement budgets in 5-year increments. In other words, you say, here is my short-term work plan for the next 5 years that I want to accomplish. Then you got to figure out how to fund it. And if I say taxes, everybody will freak out and leave the room, right? So you got to, the way to do that, in my humble opinion, having done this for a number of decades, is to lessen the financial incentives for commercial and industrial development so that your tax revenue from those businesses starts sooner, and to share the misery with everybody rather than placing it on the back of just the property owners, right? So you look at it every year to see where you are in your 5-year plan. And then comprehensive planning is the process that we are going to uptake next. Because a comprehensive plan takes all of these threads and puts them together into a document that provides something other than a doorstop. It's a resource. So when the Planning Commission has a question or they need to know demographics or they need to know how to put the transportation plan together, it's all in that book. And it's done as a community-driven process. We did the land use plan that way, the AIA that way. Who went to the Methodist Church during the land use plan period? Were any of you on board then? I think probably that generation has kind of retired and gone their way. But we held a series of meetings in the Methodist Church. They lasted almost 8 months. It was community-driven. AIA at the high school, community-driven. So that's where I'm going to stop for today. But this is what goes into comprehensive planning. And then these are the 7 elements that are required by law to be in the book. Now, I'm all about complying with the law, but I think if they're not useful chapters, kind of wasting your time. You need something you can use. Now, that's the reason we do them. Collects everything in one place. It allows the community to hold a vision and give their opinion. It fulfills a legal obligation required by the state. And it's a guide to make decisions. We're done. Did everybody survive okay? All right. We all bored to tears yet? Planning is kind of boring when you don't have somebody in the room that wants to do something. It really is. So I am open to questions. Who wants to know about what's going on in Kingston Springs? And if you have a question, ask it out loud. I'll answer it.
What are they doing next to the storage building? What are they putting in there? And how many units?
Right this minute? Not a thing. I'll tell you where that project is, and I'm always candid, so if you're easily offended, you're not going to like me much. It started out as a notice of violation. A bunch of fill was dumped on the property. It was dumped on the property without a plan or intent. It was just dumped. I mean, the developer may have had intent, but we didn't know what it was, so he was stopped. And we also required him to get an engineering report. One, I wanted to know what was in the fill, so did the city, because, I mean, you're bringing it in from somewhere else. It's not native dirt. So what we discovered is that a great deal of it came from the fairgrounds, where they're tearing up buildings and tearing down buildings, and part of the racetrack and all those facilities to make way for the new soccer stadium. Really bad idea. I have opinions too. The soccer stadium is a really bad idea in that location. There's not enough way to absorb that traffic. There's going to be some awful stuff. But anyway, that concrete was from the 30s and the 40s. And the binding agent for concrete in the 30s and the 40s was asbestos. Are we all excited now? There you go. Planning just got interesting, right? So what we required him to do was take it down to bedrock. Take it out. Then we required him to sort it. Good fill, bad fill. And then all the bad fill had to be hauled. He had to provide haul tickets to a containment site that would accept, that was lined with lead to accept that fill. And he's now in the process of grading it out, grassing it, and returning it. Now, one step further. He has proposed Originally, I believe we started with 56 apartments on that ridge for his first discussion. Nothing's been
56.
approved. 56 originally. Once the grading got done and the project was kind of on its way, it dropped to 54. Once the grading and the remediation were done and we said you can go to phase 2, it dropped to 45. That's all that's sustainable on all 3 of those parcels that have now been combined is 45 units. Now, you know you could build more units, right? You know, if you look at the ground, you could get them in there. But Kingston Springs is smart. They require play areas for children. They require parking lots. They require open space, green space. You can't touch the blue line. You can't exceed a certain topography. Because a building, it makes it hard to hold on to the side, right? So all of those things restrict it and reduce it down to 45. So where he is in the process is he came Thursday night and had a discussion about the concept. And the limiting factors for that development, just like every other development, is location. Because it's located almost directly in front of Wyman Hills Road, which goes right to the interstate. So he did a traffic study. He was one of the ones on the list. So if we can't absorb the traffic without causing a backup through the red light, the project's a no. You can't allow traffic to stack up in front of the school, in front of the ambulance service, in front of the fire hall. I mean, you just can't do that. It creates a public hazard at that point. So does that answer your question somewhat? 45 units. All right. And I would like to introduce someone. I hope I don't embarrass him when I do so. Mr. Collins, do you mind? This is Mr. Collins. This is Chris Collins. Chris owns the Midtown Inn and Suites. I am pleased to announce that Chris is redoing the Midtown Inn and Suites. It's now being completely redone on the inside. The rooms, I toured one last week. Really pretty. Doing a great job. He's changing brand names from Midtown Inn, which is a single serve, single owned, to Roadway. And then the mobile home rentals that are in the back will be going away. The mobile home park will. And Mr. Collins, within the next 6 months, is what Chris is saying. Mr. Collins wants to do a all underground utility resort RV park instead because of the traffic from the interstate with all underground utilities. So he had his discussion, and the reason that I asked him to come tonight is because he came to the Planning Commission Thursday and appropriately just had a discussion with them. This is what I'd like to do, and he sought guidance and feedback, which is the proper way to do it. That way you know what you're looking at and what your challenges are going to be. So hopefully that answers your question somewhat. And the gas convenience store across the road from the Thorntons was previously a BP. Same owner, same lot, tore it down, building it back. Now, I need to discuss nonconformity with everybody in the room. Tennessee has statutes called nonconforming uses. The BP is a nonconforming use. So if I tear down my insulated by state statute business, I am allowed to build it back. And you can't stop me. You can look at health, safety, and welfare only. I can expand it. I can keep my signs. It's insulated by state law. So the Planning Commission cannot tell someone when they tear down a commercial or industrial structure that they can't put it back. Does that help you understand how those things reoccur? Okay. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
On the traffic study that McPherson is doing, does he pay for that? And is it something,
I'm sorry?
is the traffic study that McPherson is having done, is that something that he pays for and has done?
He does.
And will the studies always pass?
No.
And will they turn in something and say, well...
The question that you're asking is kind of a two-part answer, and I want to make sure that I answer it correctly. About 6 months ago, Mr. Patno, we strengthened this traffic study requirements and amended the zoning book because it basically said you had to have 100 units or 5,000 square feet of commercial space before you were required to even do one. And that's true in every single zoning book, in every rural jurisdiction in the state of Tennessee. They all look exactly alike. So we strengthened it. We dropped that to 50 units for residential. So the traffic study was done by Klober Engineering. And do we just accept it? No. No, we don't just go, you're handing me your report, thank you, and high five, we're all happy. No. The Thorntons traffic study review took probably 2 months front to back. By the time it went off to the engineer, by the time we internalized, we sent it back a couple of times for Thorntons and had them not just isolate it to Liban Hills, we made them take the traffic data in from East Kingston Springs Road. Back in a former life, that's what I did for about 4 months for the state of Georgia. I fed all of the traffic engineering data into HECRAS to see what pops out the other side. So, does that answer your question somewhat? Okay.
Sure. I may be wrong on this, so this isn't gospel. I think when we were reviewing the Thorntons traffic study, and there was private citizen cars and trucks, commercial trucks, I believe their original plan had the capability to support overnight parking, which would include showers and those kinds of things, which would attract a greater number of trucks.
That's correct.
And as us going through the numbers and talking to them about traffic, I remember that part went away. So it's more daytime oriented.
That is a great point, and it is.
Anyway, the point to your question is, we talked a lot about it, we worked hard to understand it, and as a result, they ended up downsizing the truck service capability of that place in order for us to allow it to go in. So we do look at it.
They also, in addition to eliminating overnight parking, they reduced the number of truck bays for fueling and the number of car bays for fueling. They reduced the size of the development lot in order to accommodate drainage and some other structures that had to be done. So again, when we began that review back in February of 2017, it took 2 years. They were reviewed for lighting, landscaping, connection to the road. We can't dictate how they connect to that road. It's a state road, but we had input on it. And we increased the requirements for their traffic study because of safety standards and not wanting to block that turn into the red light going down Kingston Springs Road. So everything, it may seem as though things just appear out of the ground as if by magic, but they don't. This Planning Commission works really hard, and they have written their regulations. They're one of the few jurisdictions in the state that prohibits development in flood areas because there's a massive cost. As an example, you know, when it's going on, you don't absorb kind of the numbers, but the Nashville flood cost in excess of $4 billion over the 45-county area. Think about that for a second. $4 billion. Not to private homes. I'm talking about public infrastructure. Roads, bridges, water, sewer. Of that $4.4 billion, the taxpayers had to absorb $2.2 billion of that. So when you're looking at floodplain management, it may seem like a really good idea to build on the river or in the floodway, the path of the volatile water. But the cost to the taxpayers is staggering. And then you add on top of that that they do not pay full rates for flood insurance. You price support them. So there's a cost and a trade-off to every type of development. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I have a multitude, but I'm only going to ask.
I want them to hear them too, so speak loud.
One of my concerns, first of all, I want to congratulate Chris for what he's doing. However, what he's doing, let's be clear, some of those people that lived in those trailers are workforce that are going to be displaced, not in the city anymore. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. Kind of like President Trump's wall. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. But I do commend you for what you're doing because I think it'll be an asset to our community, number one. Number two, what bothers me, and this is, It's me, but it's not. Enforcement is something that bothers me. Who's going to go to my customer Thorntons and tell them when that truck's sitting there overnight, they got to move it? TC and they're not going to wake them up, or they haven't. Now maybe the county will, but somebody's going to have to bang on that door and say, hey pal, you got to go. Because Antioch started out as the same thing. They bought a little more parcel and they've got 28 trucks parked there at night. So that concerns me. The enforcement element concerns me on other issues. The house, I'm the snotty guy from Brentwood that complained about the house on Woodlands Drive. We put a stop work order on it. Fine. He wasn't working. He didn't care. Now, John, I did talk to John, and I called the man that owned the property and said, I live across the street. I want to let you know you got a bunch of people up and down the street that are upset. So I think John and them and the building inspector have got some things going that's going to correct that situation. But enforcement's a big deal to me. I'm not the oldest resident here, but probably one of the more aged as far as being in this town. I've seen a lot of things change. Ernest Lampley used to go around and collect money for street lights and potholes. So a lot of good things have come. I want big box. I'm probably a minority, but I know it'll never come. But I got one or two other things I'd like to ask you. Number one, city officials, if Sudden Service, and I think y'all know this, if they expand their building, they're going to have to reapply for a beer permit, which is revenue, because they're expanding it. That's just my business. I knew you knew that. Trying to get you all the dollars you can stand. Now, let me ask
They're
you
approved,
this.
by the way.
Huh?
That was approved Thursday night.
Let me ask you this, because I know of a certain property, not in this city, but in this county, that has been destroyed by floodwaters many times, and we continually rebuild it.
Yes, sir?
Is there a limitation on that?
Yes, sir. There is actually, but again, we're talking about enforcement. And enforcement in flood areas, I cringe to be blunt, but I'm going to be. Several of us in this room, during the days when I worked for the county, suffered through probably a year and a half of very public, very loud, very abusive meetings. My face never gets different than this. It's where the noise stops. Then do what you got to do. There is a structure located on Chapmansboro Road. I won't name the commissioner, but it belongs to a commissioner. It sits on the county commission, has in the past, is sitting on the commission. I've had this conversation with him to his face, so, you know, it's old news. To date, we have invested $3.3 million in the reconstruction of that house over a 20-year period. He refers to it as his remodeling fund. Now, considering the fact that you're paying that bill, you the taxpayer, through flood insurance, and then if you don't have sufficient flood insurance, then you get a 0% small business administration loan to cover the rest of your build. If you stay in the house for 5 years, that's not a loan anymore, it's a grant. You get to pay for that too. So to answer your question in the long term, why is there no enforcement? I can answer that really, really simply because when you attempt to enforce the flood regulations in this county, not only does the commission at the county level get really, really hostile about it, along with the property owners, FEMA will drive the FEMA bus over the top of you on the way out of town. So I did that for a number of years. I always play by the rules, but you have a property here in Kingston Springs where the same thing occurred, just so you know. So it's the difficulty with enforcement is not personal, it's most of the time not financial. But it's really difficult for me to see Bob in church on Sunday morning knowing his house has been flooded to the roof line, and he's lost his house, his furniture, probably his pets, his car, and tell him, you can't build that back. When Bob has $25,000 worth of insurance on a $700,000 house, that's why it doesn't get enforced. How many people in this room could comfortably do that? Tell Bob, we're going to knock your house down and you can't move back in it. That's the difficulty in enforcement. So what do you do in that situation when you're the enforcement person? You're navigating a very fine line at that point, right? There's the law that you got to follow and the actions that come behind it. So you navigate that line by saying, here are the ground rules. I've already made my decision. If another one gets made, you're going to have to countermand the one I made. Right? That insulates the process from the enforcement. So that's why enforcement's difficult. And no matter who we are, if I know you and I like you, it's much more difficult for me to hold your feet to the fire, right? Because I know your story, your history, your kids, your spouse. I hang out with you on the weekend. So that personal thing makes it much more difficult, unless you're me. Why? Because I don't review people. My work falls in a regulatory box. It's a frame. And I don't exceed that box ever, no matter what the circumstances. It's not that I don't want to be nice to Bob. I can't. They thoughtfully wrote it in such a way that I don't have the authority to climb out of that regulatory box. Because if I do, I risk exposure not only to myself, my license, my practice, my insurance, I risk exposure to the city. So does that help you to kind of understand?
I've got one last question.
That.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to prolong
Sure.
this meeting, but
Bob, real quick, in relation to what
Yeah.
you were speaking about, flood insurance, I don't remember the exact numbers, I'm sure you do, but the city, as far as what it collects in insurance for flood, is way in surplus as opposed to what it puts out because of the ordinances and regulations we have, as opposed to the rest of the nation. So you can be assured that your tax money isn't going to doing things in the city. Maybe in the county, but not
yeah, and it wasn't based on the city. I was talking more
I just
to
want everybody to know how it's working here, and the fact that we don't build in the flood zone.
Right, and the reason that it's not allowed here was the decision that was made in this town decades ago to do the smart thing. It was, at that point, nothing was built out much in a flood area. It was the decision to do the smart thing because of the cost. And you're really literally giving somebody a permit to build a structure in a place where they can drown. You're giving them permission to do it. So when you allow that to happen and you don't follow the ground rules, there is civic liability for that. Just so you know. Will FEMA ever bring it? No, but somebody with a big law firm may eventually do that. You never know. So your next topic?
last topic, just in the future, looking down the road.
Yes, sir.
And I have been on the city commission many years ago, but when we talk about new development,
Yes, sir.
and I know that this probably won't happen, I've seen it voted down before. Say we annex property out of the city limits.
Yes, sir.
And the city takes that property in. How do we intend to continue working with a privately held water company to accommodate new residents of our town? We can't force them to supply the service.
I agree. Quasi-judicial, state-created utility companies. So we have East Montgomery, Pleasant View Utility District, we have Second South Cheatham, right? Those are all non-jurisdictional entities. And you are correct. For whatever reason, a couple of decades ago, Cheatham County decided it'd be a really good idea to turn utilities particularly for water development, because if you don't have water, you're not building squat. I'm just telling you, you got to have water for everything. You got to have it to drink, you got to have it fire suppression, you got to have it water your grass. I mean, you got to have water. Take a bath, to cook, whatever. So that's the one service that seems to drive the most angst in this county. But they decided for whatever reason to enter into agreements with quasi-judicial, state-created, kind of like the development districts. They're not really authoritarian, they're not really government, but they're not really not. And what they did in the case of the county, I will not discuss the one in the city, because I wasn't here when it happened. So I don't know all the particulars of it, but I know in the county, when Pleasant Utility District was created, the county handed them the keys to the water and sewer kingdom. They did. They handed them $500,000, and they entered into an agreement that Pleasant Utility District would make a good faith effort to expand water services. Now, for those of you who don't spend any time in the land use courthouse, and I have, it's impossible to enforce a good faith effort. I'm just telling you. They look at the judge and they go, we tried. We looked at the maps. We looked at the people. We looked at the distribution areas. We didn't have the right of way. We're done. And the judge goes, see ya. That's where you are. So that's the truth of it. So if you annex, and I don't know, is there any discussion underway about annexing any property in Kingston Springs? Because if you're considering that as a town and a planning commission, see me first. Because when you take property in as an annexation, you don't get to pick the ones you like. So let's assume that I want to annex 5 parcels over. I have to take everything in between. Warts, flaws, problems, code, whatever. It's your baby now. And you can't take it unless you can, within a year, 1 year, provide the same services to that annexed property that you provide to the ones you currently have. Annexation law in Tennessee Code takes up 173 pages. So if you're considering that, keep in mind you also have to open the growth plan. And for those of you who didn't suffer through that process, not going to be the most fun you're ever going to have, because you have to invite all the boys to the table, every jurisdiction. And there's a committee. And they're a committee not by person, but by placement. ECD director, the industrial board, the water authorities, everybody gets to come play. Just so you know. Last time they opened it was 2011. And at that point, Ashland City took in Hidden Lake Resorts, because there was a turf war, because part of it goes in, a little tip of it goes into Davidson County. House caught on fire, Davidson County refused to put the fire out. And then every time they had a fire anywhere near the line, they yelled mutual aid, and the county was going broke. And the city was going broke. So they used it as leverage, so they annexed it to make that go away. Now they have all the warts and flaws that go with it. But they also have the tax revenue. Yes, sir.
Well, what I also put out here on the live stream that we have going, that I take questions and present them to you, and Don, you may want to chip in on this one a little bit too, because it's kind of tangential to this conversation, but still important. Jackie Kelly asked if we were still going to be doing the grant down along Pleasant Hills Road involving the sidewalks and the trees and so on, and where we were on that process. And that's a question that's come up quite a bit. I find myself answering quite a lot, so it could be worth talking about.
From the planning department perspective, once everything is nailed down for the particulars of the project, and this is no different than if it were Thorntons. Before it comes to the planning commission, we have to have all the stuff, right? Because we can't make stuff. We can't draw their plan. We can't tell the state what to do with its grant money. It tells us what it's willing to do. So it won't come to planning, and planning commission is required to review it. But we can discuss it, but the out plan, the final plan, won't come to us until everything's in place. So we don't know where it is in that process except from a city commission perspective. So, John, you're on first.
There are 2 projects, grant projects in town. One is the multimodal project, which is along Loop and Line and Hills Road. I call it both because I don't know who
Okay, and on a side note, the Thorntons project that was approved, they have already begun to install their section in front of Thorntons that goes with this transportation enhancement grant for the sidewalks.
It looks great.
It looks really good.
It's a nice little sample of what.
So, what do you guys want to focus on next? Not tonight. Tonight I have a deadline, the clock is ticking, I can see eyes going like, we have to do this. But your next presenter is going to be Jerome Terrell, who is the Cheatham Connect Economic Development Director for Cheatham County. We see John or Jerome through JECD meetings when they occur. Joint Economic and Community Development, all the governments come together in a room. By the way, look up when they have those. They're interesting, entertaining to attend because you see the other side of the river, so to speak. Even though I know we don't interact with people on the other side of the river. But you get to hear what's going on kind of all over the county. But he will come here and kind of delve into economic development. My advice to this jurisdiction remains the same that it did the first year that I was here, which now seems like a really long time ago. It was 06. So I kind of come and then I leave and then I come back and I leave. So my advice to them is to take the advice of their planning commission chair. You need a comprehensive plan because what we're doing is slapping band-aids on things as they occur rather than deciding what we want. And if you decide what you want, then you can establish goals to get there. It's no different than any other job that you do, right? If you're going to build a piece of furniture, I got to start somewhere. So rather than being reactive, we need to be proactive. Where is there suitable land to build? Okay, now we found some land. What is the appropriate zone? What can it absorb? What can go there? So even though what you hear in Planning Commission and read in the newspaper, it's appropriate. I'm not picking on anybody. I'm just saying you read the responses of the meetings in the newspaper is appropriate for discussion purposes in a community newspaper. It's not planning for the future. It's planning for the now. So we need to take the building blocks that we started on way back in 2008 and move forward with them and put together a plan that not only tells us what we want as a community, not me, I don't get to make the decisions and I don't want to. You live here, I don't.
I appreciate you're saying that. I think where people like me have the angst about growth in the area
Right.
is looking at the planning commission's meetings, and I know, I've looked at many of them online, and I hear you and even other commissioners say we need to maximize development, very words. And I remember one commissioner meeting saying, I wrote down, we need to decide what we want as commercial. We don't want to put in 2 houses where we could get a grocery store.
Right.
And that makes us, me as a community member, going, I have no say-so. I have no say-so.
Well, I think that when they say maximize development, and I don't know the particular quote that you're talking about.
That was maybe in the June 2019 meetings. You said maximize development.
Absolutely, and maximize development in your world probably means something different than it does in mine. In planning world, the first thing you look at is suitability. So that's the first thing we look at. We start with the land. I don't ever, it's probably been kind of the bane of my professional career, is that I never start with the personality, the person, I start with the land. I look at everything in abstract, remote, from personality. What can this land tolerate? What is its highest and best function? What does it inhibit that already exists? What hardship will it visit on the community? From not only a financial perspective, but from a safety standard, from a recreational standard, from a quality of life standard, from a character standard. I'll look at all of that. For the projects that have been done on Lubin Hills, we fought for every concession. We fought for every decision. And not only did they stick to the book, we got concessions they didn't have to give us, because we expressed to them that public sentiment was such that we could see it happening, but not happening in a shove-it-in-your-face kind of way. So those decisions and those discussions are tense sometimes not so tense, but they have to be done in order to preserve the very unique space that you live in. And every community in this county has a personality. You are all very distinctly different. So while we giggle when we say we don't talk to people across the river, the personalities are so distinct of the community. I don't mean the people, but the vibe of each community is very, very distinct. And if you do it too quickly or you do it wrong, you lose that. You just become another exit off the interstate. So I can assure you that maximizing development in the context of the maps that you saw is a pretty limited scope here, because the floodplain areas, the blue line areas, the topography, ownership, access, transportation, and safety limit all of that. Okay?
And when these ordinances and regulations are brought to the forefront to some of the people who come to us with different concepts and different proposals for projects, they realize the things that they're not taking into consideration that we're trying to consider for the community, and some of these things just go away. So just know that the things that are actually finally get to where they're coming out of the ground, it's like I said, it's years, and sometimes these projects have taken turns and twists to conform, or they just went away.
And I would advise everybody, the Planning Commission meetings, if you really want to know how this stuff works, are on YouTube. There's a link on the city's website where you can just go and click and watch the meeting. You can see what happens. We're going to work towards, my understanding was in the last meeting, towards trying to doing that live maybe. We're doing it
right now.
We're live right. For all the offended, you're not getting much sleep tonight.
I don't know that we talked necessarily about doing city and planning as live. I don't know why we couldn't, other than I think the one thing we've got to work out as far as that is sound issues. I've been communicating with people watching and said we sound a little muffled right now.
Well, and it probably will be, this will be, because if I'm not standing right next to him while he's recording on a cell phone or over there, then you're not going to hear it. And nothing frustrates me more than watching a Pleasant View meeting. You can't hear anything they say at all. Nothing. You can't hear anything in the room at all. Ever. Even when you're standing in the room, you can't hear them. So, and I'm hard of hearing, so in their defense, that may be part of the issue. But are there any other questions? But I can tell you and assure you that after decades of doing this, your planning commission really cares what happens in this town. And they work really hard to get where they get. So planning is still, from your perspective, probably an old zoning, but from my perspective, it's a rarely recent thing here, because they started in 1935 in Tennessee. Theirs didn't start here until the 80s. And they inherited a lot of the stuff that they have from the county that was already built out when they became a city. So sometimes you have to work your way out before you can work your way forward. Does that help? And Bob, as far as the enforcement thing goes, there is no job that is more contentious and less rewarding than code enforcement. And no matter if you do it right, you're wrong, and if you do it wrong, you're right. I mean, there's nobody loves it. Nobody likes it, and there's noise. So for those of you who would like to see code enforcement, when the public yelling starts, suck it up, because that goes with it. Nobody likes it. So there's noise and contention with it. All right?
I think we're almost up against the time.
We are. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.